Welcome to a special presentation on the Left Turn Network, President John F. Kennedy, his legacy, the tragedy, and the aftermath. John Fitzgerald Kennedy was born to his parents Joseph P. and Rose Kennedy in 1917 in Massachusetts. And he was born into a very rich and wealthy family. Joseph P. Kennedy was a businessman, an investor, has a colorful history. He was the first chairman of the Securities and Exchange Commission. He was a big supporter of President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He also was the ambassador to the United Kingdom in the late 1930s. John F. Kennedy served in World War II on a PT boat, and he was injured severely. His back was injured severely when the Japanese struck the PT-109 boat. John F. Kennedy was elected President of the United States of America in 1960 after being elected to Congress and to the Senate and serving in Congress, in the House and Senate in the late 1940s and 1950s. He beat Richard Nixon in one of the closest elections in history and was our youngest elected president. He became the 35th president of the United States. He took office in 1961. Here he is with his brothers, Robert Kennedy and Edward Kennedy. He appointed Robert Francis Kennedy the Attorney General, and there were charges of nepotism at the time, but the advice of Robert Kennedy would prove crucial in very critical moments in our country's history, in his term, in his only term. President Kennedy had a lot of challenges. One of them was civil rights. Here he is giving a speech about civil rights in the Oval Office. He stood firm against various Southern governors who were trying to prevent African American students from entering the University of Mississippi and the University of Alabama. With the help of Robert Kennedy, he helped make integration into universities a reality. Here he is before the United States Congress in 1961, challenging America to be competitors in the space race against the Soviet Union by putting a man on the moon by the end of the 1960s. And we did it. We did it in July 1969. Unfortunately, he was not alive to see it, but the man sitting behind him on the left, Vice President Johnson, made sure of that. Here, President Kennedy is standing firm against the Soviets in West Berlin. At one time, Berlin was divided into East and West. Essentially, a free zone was West Berlin. East Berlin was controlled by the communists. And here he is saying, Ich bin ein Berliner. I'm a citizen of Berlin. I'm a person of Berlin. He helped to stand against the communists who were threatening the stability of West Berlin. In the early months of his presidency, in April 1961, he was presented with a plan which he agreed to for Cuban exiles to invade Cuba to overthrow Fidel Castro. The plan failed. He had taken the advice of military and intelligence leaders, and it was the early days of his presidency. It was something that he regretted, and he remembered when in October 1962 it was discovered that the Soviet Union was constructing in Cuba nuclear missile silos 90 miles off the shores of Florida. So he decided, instead of going to war, basically precipitating World War III, he signed a quarantine proclamation to quarantine out these freighters that were delivering the materials and the nuclear missiles. And so this was a success. On November 22, 1963, President Kennedy was campaigning in Dallas, Texas, along with his wife Jackie. In front of him, in this picture of the limousine as it's going through downtown Dallas, is Governor of Texas John Connally and his wife Nellie. You can see the exuberance of the crowd. In a few moments, he will turn into Dealey Plaza and he will be gunned down. This is a picture of First Lady Jackie Kennedy at the state funeral of President Kennedy. Behind her is Attorney General Robert Kennedy. Jackie Kennedy is holding the hands of her daughter, Caroline, who just became ambassador to Japan in November 2013. Also, she's holding the hands of her son, John Jr., who died in a plane crash in the late 1990s. It is alleged that Lee Harvey Oswald shot President Kennedy and shot also at Governor Connally from the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository on Elm Street in Dallas, Texas on November 22nd, 1963. But he never was able to face a trial because Jack Ruby shot Lee Harvey Oswald in the parking garage of the Dallas Police Headquarters on November 24th. So we're left to ask, was it only Lee Harvey Oswald, a self-professed Marxist with delusions of grandeur, who lived kind of a ne'er-do-well life? He defected to the Soviet Union, didn't like it, and came back? Landslide Lyndon, the vice president with the shady past. Google the Bobby Baker scandal. Time magazine was working on a very important cover that could have possibly ended Lyndon Johnson's political career. He was surrounded by some pretty shady people who could have very well had a role. Possibly, maybe the mob had a part in it. Here you see Carlos Marcello, otherwise known as the Little Man, a mobster in New Orleans who was being prosecuted by the Robert Kennedy Justice Department. Or possibly it was the CIA. Here is E. Howard Hunt testifying to a congressional committee in the 1970s. He claims to have left the agency in 1970. He acted as President Nixon's one of his security consultants. Google the Watergate scandal. E. Howard Hunt was involved with that. Could have been involved with Cuban exiles who were mad about what was going on in Cuba. The National Defense Establishment. You know, Major General Smedley Butler wrote a book in the 1930s called War's a Racket. War's a big business, you know, and there was concern that maybe we would not be going to war in South Vietnam. Or possibly a government cabal. All sorts of different forces within the government conspiring. Perhaps it was FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover who didn't want to retire. Perhaps it was various forces within the CIA working with the FBI. Just one more thing. Why is the United States government continuing to hold documents related to the 1963 assassination in secret until 2017? I think the documents should be released now. I think it's time for an openness about what happened. While the Warren Commission investigated the assassination and made their finding that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone, and while there was an assassinations committee in the U.S. House of Representatives in the 1970s that determined that there was some sort of conspiracy involved, we're probably, despite all of this, and we're probably not going to get all of the answers to the questions because Lee Harvey Oswald never stood trial in Texas for the crime. And so he didn't have his day in court. I myself believe that President Kennedy was never going to leave that plaza alive. If you look at the Zapruder film, close-ups of it, it was quite obvious. And I question whether Lee Harvey Oswald fired the fatal shot. It's certainly possible, even, that he was a patsy, as he said, after he was arrested. And all we're left with, really, is the history that happened afterwards. A lot happened. A lot of Kennedy's efforts for civil rights got rolled into the 1964 Civil Rights Act that was signed by President Johnson. But there was also a lot of turbulence. We did go into Vietnam, and that war would not end really until the takeover of Saigon in 1975, the year that I was born, when we evacuated our embassy. Martin Luther King Jr., a civil rights leader, African-American civil rights leader, was assassinated in April 1968. And, if you remember earlier in this special, I talked about Robert F. Kennedy. Robert F. Kennedy, John F. Kennedy's brother, Robert Francis Kennedy, was assassinated in a hotel kitchen after a California rally where he was seeking the Democratic nomination for the presidency of the United States. If you think about it, you had a president in an open car, friendly crowds, and you had a car about ready to get onto an expressway. And it was the first, essentially, video assassination, video that showed an assassination. And people did see a lot of this on television. These kinds of tragedies have an aftermath. There are results. There was a credibility gap because after Kennedy came Johnson, who lied about Vietnam, lied about many things. Then Nixon, Watergate. And so trust in government declined. There was a lot of social disorder. Now, of course, I didn't live in 1963. I was born in 1975. But I remember the Challenger disaster, and that was something you can never forget. I was called out of my elementary school classroom with my classmates, and we went into the computer room and watched on the monitors the explosion of the Challenger, and what a horrible tragedy, the loss of the astronauts. And the sadness. And I talked with my grandfather that weekend afterwards, and I won't ever forget that. And I really thought that itself would be probably the biggest tragedy that I would ever see in my lifetime. But then on September the 11th, 2001, I was at work. And I was told by my supervisor, along with the other employees, about what had happened. I wouldn't see video of it until lunchtime. The towers collapsing. And the questions, of course, came afterwards, a lot like with the Kennedy assassination. People had questions about Building 7. We live in a society here in the United States where we can question the assassination of a president. We can express our dissent and our questions. We can hold people to account. We can challenge our our government to release documents, and we can speculate. We can do so freely without repercussion. And we can do so about September 11th. But each time these horrible things happen, it impacts our history, and it impacts it in such a way that it in some ways creates an alternate timeline. I mean, it becomes our reality, of course, but what would have happened if President Kennedy had lived? Could he have been able to have helped the country go forward through tougher times, maybe better than Lyndon Johnson did? Would his reelection somehow caused Richard Nixon to not have been elected in 1968? Would we have ever had Watergate? Would we have ever had the debacle in Vietnam? Or if we'd had the war in Vietnam, would the outcome have been different? Would our trust in government be higher? Maybe things would have been worse. We don't know. If September 11th hadn't happened, would our population be, let's be quite frank, would our population be less paranoid? Our government be less paranoid? Would fear be less of a currency in the media? In some ways, I think these kinds of things short-circuit us. In some ways, they have a way of hurting our country more than a Great Depression, more than a war. I mean, we did have after September 11th these wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, but I think that there's something that's deeper. And I think when we lost President Kennedy, we lost something that was deeper. You know, if you look at just the film, not the Zapruder film, but the film of his visits to Florida and to Texas, you'll see something that's something unique. And some say it's a shattered innocence, an innocence of that time. You know, we hear about schools being locked down, school shootings, people on these medications, antidepressant medications, going nuts. I lost my father to suicide. I lost my brother to suicide. I think not just the United States, but the world, in some ways, may have gone off the deep end after this. Not that things were great in the early 60s. There were problems, of course. But we did lose something. And each time these big tragedies happen, we seem to go further and further and retreat into a darker and darker corner. And one day, we can only hope that we find our ways back more to the light. I feel confident, certainly in the younger generation, and even in my generation, as the baby boomers begin to fade away, that things could possibly return to an even keel. Not back to the innocence of the early 60s, but certainly away from the horrors of the big-handed responses to these things, and the distrust and the anger. So that's what I think about all of this. Today, November 22nd, 2013. Thank you for watching. Take it easy. Please subscribe, and please visit www.theleftturnetwork.com. Later.